The Washington 1995 cold case that finally cracked sent shockwaves through a community that thought they knew everyone's secrets. Patricia Barnes waved goodbye on August 25, planning a simple trip that should have taken hours. She never arrived. Her body was discovered on a lonely road near Olalla, partially unclothed, leaving investigators with biological evidence but no answers. For 27 years, her daughters refused to give up hope while detectives watched leads evaporate into silence. The case file gathered dust until cutting-edge DNA science breathed new life into forgotten evidence. Genetic genealogists built family trees from microscopic traces, following bloodlines through decades of history until one name surfaced from the shadows. But when investigators finally identified Patricia's killer in October 2022, they discovered something that would deny her family the courtroom justice they had fought for all these years. What happens when the truth arrives too late for punishment? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Patricia Barnes set her house keys on the kitchen counter and glanced at the clock. August 25, 1995. The morning air carried the scent of late summer, and sunlight streamed through windows she had wiped clean the day before. At 61, Patricia moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to treasure ordinary moments. She smoothed her blouse and checked her purse one final time. "I'll be back by evening," she had told her daughters the night before. The trip was nothing special, a drive across Kitsap County to visit an old friend. She had made similar journeys countless times, navigating familiar roads that wound through Washington's evergreen forests and small communities. Patricia touched the doorframe as she stepped outside, a habit she had developed over years of coming and going from this house that held her life's memories. The car door closed with a soft click. Patricia adjusted her rearview mirror and backed down the driveway, waving at a neighbor who was watering flowers in the morning sunshine. The radio played quietly as she turned onto the main road, disappearing into the ordinary flow of traffic on what should have been an unremarkable day. By noon, concern would creep into her daughter's voice during an unanswered phone call. By evening, fear would take root. By midnight, the kind of dread that changes everything would settle over those who loved her most. Patricia Barnes had left home expecting to return. She never would. The passerby noticed something wrong immediately. A shape beside the rural road near Olalla that didn't belong in the natural landscape of ferns and Douglas fir trees. The morning of August 26th was crisp and clear, the kind of day that usually brought peace to Washington's quieter corners. Instead, it brought horror. Sheriff's deputies arrived within 20 minutes, their patrol cars cutting through the forest silence with urgent efficiency. The scene they found would haunt them for decades. Patricia lay partially unclothed along the roadside, her body positioned in a way that spoke of violence and violation. Crime scene tape fluttered in the morning breeze, creating a yellow barrier between this terrible discovery and the world of the living. Detective Sarah Mitchell was among the first investigators to arrive. She had worked difficult cases before, but something about Patricia's peaceful face, even in death, struck her as profoundly wrong. This was someone's mother, someone's friend, someone who had woken up yesterday morning expecting to see another sunset. Now she would become a case number, a set of evidence bags, a story that needed solving. The biological evidence collection began immediately. Swabs, samples, photographs, each piece carefully cataloged and preserved in sterile containers. The investigators worked with methodical precision, knowing that every detail mattered. Every trace of DNA could be the key to justice. They had no way of knowing that the science to unlock these secrets was still years away, sleeping in the future like an unwritten promise. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit community. Patricia Barnes was dead. Someone had killed her and left her body on a lonely road like discarded trash. The fear that settled over Kitsap County that day would linger for decades, a shadow that touched every family with daughters, every woman who drove alone. Detective Mitchell returned to the crime scene as the morning sun climbed higher, bringing additional investigators and the weight of responsibility that comes with a fresh homicide. The evidence collection kit sat heavy in her hands, sterile containers that would hold biological samples, waiting decades for science to catch up with hope. The initial canvas revealed little. Patricia had been driving alone, planning to visit a friend in a neighboring town. Her car was found abandoned several miles away, keys missing, purse gone. The rural road where her body was discovered saw little traffic, especially at night. Whoever had chosen this location knew it would provide privacy for terrible acts and time before discovery. Investigators fanned out across the county, interviewing anyone who might have seen Patricia on August 25th. They questioned gas station attendants, restaurant workers, anyone who worked along the routes Patricia might have taken. They spoke with her friend, confirming that Patricia had never arrived for their planned visit. Phone records showed no unusual calls. Credit cards revealed no suspicious transactions. Detective Mitchell filled page after page in her notebook, documenting every interview, every lead, every theory that emerged from their investigation. She wrote down names of potential suspects, drawing lines between possible connections, crossing out theories that led nowhere. The notebook became a testament to human effort colliding with limited technology and elusive truth. Forensic analysis of the biological evidence provided confirmation that Patricia had been sexually assaulted before her death, but the DNA technology of 1995 could only tell them so much. The genetic profile they recovered didn't match anyone in the limited databases available at the time. The killer's identity remained locked in microscopic evidence that would wait more than 2 decades for the right key to unlock its secrets. As weeks passed, the initial surge of investigative activity began to slow. Tips dried up. Witnesses had nothing more to add. The case that had started with such urgency began its gradual slide toward the dreaded designation that every detective feared: unsolved. The church filled slowly on a September morning that felt too bright for such darkness. Patricia's daughters sat in the front pew, their grief a tangible presence that seemed to pull all oxygen from the sacred space. Friends and neighbors filed past the open casket, each taking a moment to look upon Patricia's peaceful face, one final time before the lid would close forever. The memorial guest book filled with signatures, handwritten names of people who promised never to forget Patricia's story, never to stop caring about justice for a woman who had lived quietly and died violent. Co-workers signed their names alongside neighbors who had waved at Patricia from their gardens. Former students added their remembrances, grateful for a teacher who had shaped their early years with patience and kindness. Patricia's eldest daughter rose to speak, her voice breaking as she described a mother who had taught them strength through example, who had faced life's difficulties with grace and faith. She believed in truth, the daughter whispered through tears. She believed that right would always prevail, even when it seemed impossible. We will not let her down. Congregation joined in hymns that Patricia had loved, their voices rising toward vaulted ceilings in an attempt to reach heaven itself. The service was simple, reflecting Patricia's modest life, but the emotion was overwhelming. This was not just a funeral for one woman, it was the community's attempt to process their own fear, their own vulnerability, their own desperate hope that whoever had done this would someday face justice. When the service ended and the coffin was carried to the waiting hearse, the silence that followed was unbearable. Patricia Barnes was truly gone, taking with her any chance of identifying her killer through her own testimony. The investigation would have to speak for her now, and the weight of that responsibility settled heavily on everyone who had promised to remember. October brought rain to Kitsap County, and with it, the slow realization that Patricia's killer might never be found. Detective Mitchell's notebook had grown thick with interviews, theories, and dead ends. She sat in her office on a gray afternoon, reviewing the case file that had consumed her thoughts for weeks. The first suspects had been obvious men in Patricia's life, recent acquaintances, anyone with a criminal history involving violence against women. Each had been questioned, their alibis checked and confirmed. Several had voluntarily submitted to polygraph examinations, all of which they passed. The investigation had methodically eliminated person after person, narrowing the field of possibilities until almost nothing remained. A tip line had generated hundreds of calls in the first weeks after Patricia's death. Citizens reported suspicious vehicles, strange men in their neighborhoods, anyone whose behavior seemed unusual around the time of the murder. Each tip had been followed up, documented, investigated. None had produced meaningful evidence. The killer remained a ghost, someone who had emerged from nowhere to destroy Patricia's life and then vanished back into anonymity. Detective Mitchell found herself driving past the crime scene at odd hours, hoping that something previously overlooked might reveal itself in different lighting. From a different angle, the yellow crime scene tape had long since been removed, but the location remained vivid in her memory. She could picture exactly where Patricia's body had been found, could recall every detail of the evidence collection process. The biological samples sat in the evidence room, carefully labeled and preserved, waiting for technology that didn't yet exist to unlock their secrets. In 1995, DNA analysis was limited, expensive, and often inconclusive. The genetic profile they had extracted told them that Patricia's killer was male, but that narrowed the suspect pool by only half the population. Without a specific person to compare it to, the DNA was simply scientific confirmation of what they already knew: someone had committed a terrible crime and walked away. By spring of 1996, Patricia's case file had been moved to a metal cabinet reserved for unsolved homicides. The thick folder joined dozens of others' cases where evidence existed, but leads had expired, where families waited for phone calls that might never come, where justice remained elusive despite everyone's best efforts. Detective Mitchell visited Patricia's daughters regularly, updating them on any developments, no matter how minor. The conversations grew shorter as the months passed, the updates less frequent. There simply wasn't much to report. The investigation had reached the limitations of 1,990 seconds technology and investigative technique. Without new evidence or witnesses, the case could only wait. The cabinet drawer closed with a metallic sound that seemed to echo with finality. Patricia Barnes had become a cold case, a designation that felt like betrayal to everyone who remembered her gentle smile and senseless death. The evidence remained carefully preserved, the file meticulously maintained, but active investigation had ceased. Patricia's killer had successfully disappeared into the vast anonymity of American life. Other cases demanded attention: fresh homicides, where witnesses still remembered details, where evidence was warm and leads were active. Detective Mitchell found herself working new investigations while Patricia's case receded into the background, though never completely out of mind. Late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, she would sometimes think about Patricia's face in that crime scene photograph. Peaceful, even in death, deserving of answers that seemed increasingly unlikely to arrive. The community gradually healed from the immediate trauma of Patricia's death, though uneasily. Women still looked over their shoulders when walking alone. Parents still worried about their daughters driving unfamiliar roads. Patricia's murder had taught Kitsap County that terrible things could happen to innocent people, and that knowledge couldn't be unlearned. The fear had settled into the background of daily life, a permanent shadow that would remain until someone answered for what they had done on that August night in 1995. The late 1,990 seconds brought a different kind of pain for Patricia's daughters, the realization that grief doesn't follow a schedule or respond to well-meaning advice about moving on. Holidays became endurance tests. Birthdays passed with an empty chair that no one mentioned, but everyone noticed. The dining room table that had once hosted Patricia's laughter and stories now felt too large, too quiet, too haunted by absence. Patricia's youngest daughter found herself picking up the phone to call her mother before remembering, each time, that no one would answer. The muscle memory of love proved stronger than the reality of loss. She kept Patricia's number in her address book for years, unable to cross it out, unwilling to accept that finality. Family gatherings centered around Patricia's memory, but struggled under its weight. Her daughters shared stories about their mother's strength, her humor, her unwavering faith that everything would work out in the end. They spoke of her belief in justice, her conviction that truth would always surface, even when it seemed buried beyond recovery. These conversations became rituals of remembrance, ways to keep Patricia present even in her absence. The daughters made a promise to each other during one particularly difficult Christmas season. They would never stop seeking answers. They would never let Patricia's case fade into the bureaucratic limbo that claims so many unsolved murders. Every year, they would call the sheriff's office. Every year, they would ask if there were any new developments, any fresh leads, any reason for hope. It was a promise born of love and sustained by stubborn faith. Faith that somewhere, Patricia's killer lived with the knowledge of what he had done, and that someday, somehow, that knowledge would surface. The daughters couldn't know that their mother's killer was already carrying his secret into a new millennium, or that time itself would become both their greatest enemy and unexpected ally. The year 2000 arrived with celebration and anxiety about computer systems, but for Patricia's daughters, it simply marked 5 years since their mother's death. The new millennium brought no new leads, no breakthrough moments, no reason to believe that Patricia's case would ever be resolved. The investigation had grown cold despite the best efforts of dedicated investigators, and technology had not yet evolved to the point where old evidence could yield new answers. Detective Mitchell had retired by then, replaced by younger investigators who inherited cases they had not worked from the beginning. Patricia's file was occasionally reviewed, but each new detective reached the same conclusion: without additional evidence or witnesses, the case could not be advanced. The biological samples remained in evidence storage, carefully preserved but scientifically limited by the technology available. Across the country, other cold cases were beginning to benefit from advances in DNA analysis, but the sophisticated genetic genealogy techniques that would eventually solve Patricia's murder were still decades away. The databases were small, the analysis methods crude compared to what would eventually become possible. Patricia's killer remained safely anonymous, protected by the limitations of 1,990 seconds forensic science. Unbeknownst to investigators, Patricia's family, or the community that still remembered her death, Donald Dean McQuaid died in 2002. The man who had destroyed Patricia's life and haunted her family's dreams passed away quietly, taking his terrible secret with him. His death removed any possibility of traditional justice: arrest, trial, conviction, punishment, but it did not erase the genetic evidence he had left behind. That evidence waited patiently in storage containers, holding McQuaid's identity like a time-delayed message that would not be decoded for another 20 years. The new millennium had brought no answers, but it had not erased the possibility of answers. Patricia's case slept, but it did not die. By 2015, Patricia's case had outlived several generations of investigators. The original detectives had retired or transferred, leaving behind detailed files that newer officers reviewed with fresh eyes and unchanged conclusions. 20 years had passed since Patricia's death, and her killer remained unidentified despite advances in forensic science that had solved other cold cases throughout Washington state. Computer databases had replaced the metal filing cabinets where Patricia's case had once slept. Digital files made information more accessible, more searchable, more easily shared between agencies. Detective James Rodriguez was among the new generation of investigators who specialized in cold cases, armed with technological tools that Detective Mitchell could never have imagined in 1995. Rodriguez spent an October afternoon reviewing Patricia's file, reading through decades of investigative reports, witness interviews, and forensic analysis. The case intrigued him not because it was unique, but because it was so typical of unsolved homicides from the pre-digital era. Good evidence had been collected, competent investigation had been conducted, and yet the killer had escaped identification purely because the technology to analyze genetic evidence had not yet existed. The DNA profile from Patricia's case sat in multiple databases, waiting for a match that never came. The sample was clean, viable, and scientifically sound, but it pointed to someone who had never been arrested, never been required to submit DNA to law enforcement databases, never appeared on the radar of traditional criminal investigation. Rodriguez had seen dozens of similar cases, evidence rich but answer poor, scientifically precise but practically useless. He made notes in Patricia's digital file, adding his own observations to 2 decades of documentation. The case deserved renewed attention, but Rodriguez couldn't yet know that the tools to solve it were finally beginning to emerge from university laboratories and private companies working at the cutting edge of genetic genealogy. Patricia's long wait for justice was nearly over, though no one suspected it yet. The breakthrough came not from traditional law enforcement channels but from the intersection of consumer genetics and cold case investigation. By 2018, millions of Americans had submitted DNA samples to ancestry websites, unknowingly creating the world's largest criminal identification database. Washington state investigators had begun to explore whether this genetic genealogy could unlock cold cases that had resisted traditional investigation for decades. Patricia's DNA sample was among the first to be analyzed using these new techniques. The genetic profile that had sat uselessly in criminal databases for over 20 years suddenly became a roadmap to identification when compared against the vast family trees being constructed by genealogy websites. The same DNA that had been scientifically sophisticated but practically worthless in 1995 was now a key that could open doors that had been locked for generations. Detective Rodriguez received the call on a Tuesday morning in May. The state crime lab had confirmed that Patricia's evidence was suitable for genetic genealogy analysis. The biological samples that had been collected and preserved so carefully in 1995 had survived storage and remained viable for the most advanced DNA analysis available. After 23 years, Patricia's case was about to become active again. The process would take months, possibly years. Genetic genealogists would build family trees using the killer's DNA, working backwards through generations to identify possible suspects. They would trace bloodlines and family connections, narrowing the field from thousands of possibilities to dozens, then hopefully to one. It was painstaking work that combined cutting-edge science with old-fashioned genealogical research, but it had already solved cold cases throughout the country. Rodriguez felt a mixture of excitement and caution. He had worked enough cold cases to know that breakthrough moments could lead to dead ends, that promising leads could evaporate upon closer examination. But for the first time in decades, Patricia's case had genuine reason for hope. The DNA that had preserved her killer's identity through 23 years of anonymity was about to speak his name. The Washington State Attorney General's Cold Case Task Force had been quietly revolutionizing criminal investigations since its formation in 2019. Staffed by seasoned investigators and equipped with the latest genetic genealogy technology, the task force specialized in cases exactly like Patricia's decades-old homicides with good DNA evidence but no traditional leads. Detective Rodriguez presented Patricia's case during a humid August meeting in 2019. The conference room whiteboard was covered with case summaries, timelines, and suspect profiles from investigations spanning 30 years. Patricia's name joined the list of victims whose stories the task force was committed to resolving, whose families deserved answers regardless of how much time had passed. The decision was unanimous. Patricia's case would be prioritized for genetic genealogy analysis. The evidence was strong, the DNA profile was clean, and the original investigation had been thorough enough to rule out obvious suspects. Everything pointed to a perpetrator who had successfully avoided law enforcement for more than 2 decades, exactly the type of case where genetic genealogy proved most effective. Task force members understood the significance of what they were attempting. Each solved case represented not just closure for one family, but validation of techniques that could unlock hundreds of similar investigations. Patricia's case could become a template for resolving other homicides from the 1,990 seconds, when evidence collection was sophisticated but analysis was limited. The genealogists assigned to Patricia's case began their work with characteristic caution. They had learned from previous investigations that genetic genealogy required patience, precision, and willingness to follow leads wherever they pointed. Family trees could reveal uncomfortable truths about biological relationships, illegitimate children, and long-buried family secrets. The search for Patricia's killer might expose information that living relatives preferred to keep private, but the task force had also learned that truth, however uncomfortable, was preferable to uncertainty. Patricia's daughters had waited 24 years for answers. The community of Olalla still carried the unease that comes from unsolved violence. Patricia herself deserved to have her killer identified and held accountable, even if accountability now could only mean public acknowledgement of guilt rather than legal punishment. The genealogy chart grew slowly through 2020, one connection at a time. Expert genealogists worked with Patricia's killer's DNA profile, comparing it against massive databases of genetic information voluntarily provided by people researching their family histories. The branching family connections looked like an elaborate tree, with each generation revealing new possibilities and new questions. The process was meticulous and often frustrating. Genetic genealogy required building family trees for multiple potential suspects, tracing bloodlines through marriage records, birth certificates, death records, and immigration documents. Some leads would peter out when DNA comparisons ruled out entire family lines. Others would branch into dozens of possibilities that each required individual investigation. The genealogists working Patricia's case began to focus on families with roots in the Pacific Northwest, particularly those with male relatives who would have been adults in 1995. They cross-referenced genetic matches with geographic information, looking for family lines that had connections to Kitsap County during the time period when Patricia was killed. By late 2020, one family name appeared repeatedly in their research: McQuaid. Multiple genetic matches pointed to this family line, and several branches had historical connections to Washington state. The genealogists began constructing a detailed McQuaid family tree, working backwards from known relatives to identify men who could potentially match the age and location profile of Patricia's killer. The work was complicated by incomplete records, name changes, and family members who had moved frequently. Some branches of the McQuaid family tree led to dead ends, where records were missing or relatives had died without leaving clear descendants. But the genetic connections were strong enough to keep the genealogists focused on this particular family, confident that somewhere within the branching connections lay the identity of the man who had killed Patricia Barnes 25 years earlier. Each new connection brought both hope and uncertainty. The McQuaid family tree was revealing its secrets slowly, generation by generation, marriage by marriage, moving steadily toward the moment when one name would emerge as the most likely suspect. Donald Dean McQuaid's name first appeared in the case file during a cold January morning in 2021. The genetic genealogists had spent months constructing family trees and analyzing DNA matches, and their research kept pointing toward this particular branch of the McQuaid family. Born in 1961, Donald would have been 34 years old when Patricia was killed, the right age to match witness descriptions of a man seen in the area around the time of her disappearance. Database match reports printed out page after page of genetic connections, all pointing toward Donald McQuaid as the source of the DNA found at Patricia's crime scene. The genealogists had built their case methodically, ruling out other family members through additional DNA comparisons with living relatives who had voluntarily provided samples to ancestry websites. Detective Rodriguez felt the familiar mixture of excitement and caution that came with promising leads. Donald McQuaid looked good on paper: right age, right location, right family connections, but Rodriguez had learned not to celebrate until DNA comparisons were absolutely conclusive. Too many potential suspects had fallen apart under closer scrutiny. Too many families had been put through the trauma of investigation only to be ruled out by science. The next step was to locate Donald McQuaid and either interview him or collect a DNA sample for direct comparison. Rodriguez began the process of tracking McQuaid's current address, employment history, and legal status. What he discovered changed everything about the investigation and Patricia's family's hopes for traditional justice. Donald Dean McQuaid had died on March 15, 2002, just 7 years after killing Patricia Barnes. He had lived with his secret for less than a decade before natural causes ended his life at age 41. The man who had destroyed Patricia's family and terrorized an entire community had escaped earthly justice by 20 years, dying peacefully while Patricia's daughters still called the sheriff's office annually, asking for updates on their mother's case. Death had granted McQuaid the ultimate immunity from prosecution, but it had not erased the genetic evidence he had left behind. The DNA that identified him as Patricia's killer would speak the truth that he had carried to his grave. The meeting took place on a Tuesday morning in March 2021, in a small conference room at the Kitsap County Sheriff's Office. Patricia's daughters sat across from Detective Rodriguez and Task Force investigator Sarah Chen, 26 years after their mother's death, finally about to learn the name of the man who had killed her. Rodriguez spoke carefully, aware that every word would be remembered forever by these women who had waited so long for this moment. He explained the genetic genealogy process, the months of research, the family tree construction that had led investigators to one conclusion. The killer had been identified with scientific certainty. His name was Donald Dean McQuaid. Patricia's eldest daughter gripped her sister's hand as Rodriguez continued. McQuaid had been 34 at the time of the murder, living in the general area, with no known connection to Patricia. He appeared to have been what investigators called a stranger killer, someone who had encountered Patricia by chance and opportunity, destroyed her life impulsively, and then disappeared back into anonymity. The death certificate Rodriguez placed on the table felt like a physical blow. Donald Dean McQuaid had died on March 15, 2002. There would be no arrest, no trial, no opportunity for Patricia's family to look their mother's killer in the eye and demand answers. The justice they had prayed for, worked toward, and waited for was impossible. McQuaid had died peacefully while they continued to suffer. The silence in the conference room stretched for several minutes. Patricia's daughters sat holding hands, processing information that answered the question that had haunted them for decades, while simultaneously denying them the resolution they had imagined. They knew who had killed their mother, but they would never see him held accountable in any meaningful way. Finally, Patricia's youngest daughter spoke. "At least we know," she whispered. "At least we can stop wondering. At least we can tell people that our mother's killer has been identified, even if he's beyond punishment." The words carried both gratitude and profound sadness, thankful for truth, heartbroken by its limitations, knowledge without justice, answers without accountability, closure without the satisfaction of seeing guilt punished. The press release required careful drafting. Attorney General Bob Ferguson's office had solved dozens of cold cases using genetic genealogy, but each announcement carried the weight of decades-long grief and community trauma. The statement about Patricia Barnes would need to balance scientific achievement with respect for a family that had waited 27 years for answers. Legal teams reviewed every sentence, ensuring that the identification of Donald Dean McQuaid was presented with appropriate certainty while acknowledging the unusual circumstances of his death occurring 20 years before the case was solved. The press release would need to explain genetic genealogy in terms that the public could understand while maintaining the dignity that Patricia's memory deserved. Detective Rodriguez worked with public affairs specialists to prepare for the inevitable media attention. Patricia's case would generate significant coverage, not just because of the length of time it had remained unsolved, but because of the innovative science that had finally cracked it. The case would become a symbol of both investigative persistence and technological advancement, proof that time didn't necessarily protect killers from identification. The date was set for October 25, 2022, 27 years and 2 months after Patricia's death. Her daughters would be present for the announcement, standing quietly in support of the investigators who had never given up on their mother's case. The press conference would be held at the Attorney General's office in Seattle, with remote participation from Kitsap County officials who had maintained jurisdiction over the investigation. Preparation included briefing statements for officials who might be asked about similar cases, the success rate of genetic genealogy in cold case investigations, and the implications for other unsolved homicides throughout Washington state. Patricia's case would likely generate inquiries from families of other victims, all hoping that their loved ones' cases might also benefit from these advanced techniques. The announcement would mark not just the resolution of Patricia Barnes' murder, but the validation of investigative techniques that were transforming cold case work throughout the country. 27 years after her death, Patricia would finally have her day in the public spotlight, her killer's name spoken aloud for the world to hear. The press conference room filled slowly on the morning of October 25, 2022. News cameras positioned themselves for optimal angles. Reporters checked their recording equipment and law enforcement officials made final preparations for an announcement that would echo across Washington state and beyond. Patricia's daughters sat in the front row, their presence lending gravity to proceedings that were already heavy with decades of accumulated emotion. Attorney General Bob Ferguson approached the podium with the measured bearing of someone who understood the significance of the moment. Behind him, display boards showed Patricia's photograph from 1995, a smiling woman whose life had been cut short by senseless violence, whose family had spent nearly 3 decades seeking answers. Today, I am pleased to announce that the Washington State Attorney General's Office, in partnership with the Kitsap County Sheriff's Office, has identified the person responsible for the 1995 murder of Patricia Barnes, Ferguson began. The cameras rolled, capturing every word for broadcast across the region where Patricia's death had once terrorized an entire community. Ferguson explained the genetic genealogy process, the years of work by dedicated investigators and scientists, and the breakthrough that had finally identified Donald Dean McQuaid as Patricia's killer. He spoke Patricia's name repeatedly, ensuring that the victim remained central to a story that could easily focus on technological achievement rather than human loss. The room was silent except for the quiet whir of cameras and the scratching of reporters' pens. This was the moment Patricia's daughters had waited for, since 1995 public acknowledgement that their mother's killer had been identified, that her case had not been forgotten, that justice had a name even if it could no longer exact punishment. When Ferguson finished his prepared statement and opened the floor for questions, the first inquiry was inevitable. Since McQuaid died in 2002, there will be no prosecution. How does the family feel about this resolution? Patricia's daughters had known this question would come, had prepared themselves for the public acknowledgement of their bittersweet victory. Truth without trials, answers without accountability, closure without the satisfaction of seeing justice served in court. The local newspapers led with headlines that seemed to shout across Kitsap County, Patricia Barnes' case solved after 27 years and DNA identifies Olalla woman's killer. The announcement rippled through communities that had lived with the unsolved murder for nearly 3 decades, bringing relief mixed with renewed sorrow for a crime that had shaped local consciousness about safety and vulnerability. At coffee shops and grocery stores throughout the region, residents who remembered Patricia's death shared their reactions to news that had seemed impossible for so many years. Older residents recalled the fear that had gripped the area in 1995, the way women had altered their routines and parents had worried about their daughters. The identification of McQuaid didn't erase those memories, but it provided context that had been missing for decades. Neighbors who had known Patricia personally felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that her killer had been identified, combined with frustration that he had died without facing consequences for his actions. The revelation that McQuaid had been a stranger to Patricia challenged assumptions that some residents had carried for years, theories about local suspects, whispered speculation about people they knew who might have been capable of such violence. The community's response reflected broader questions about justice, closure, and the meaning of resolution when traditional legal processes are impossible. Patricia's case had been solved in the truest sense. Her killer was known, the mystery was resolved. The family had answers, but the absence of arrest, trial, and punishment left many people unsatisfied with the conclusion. Local clergy found, from themselves, counseling parishioners who struggled with the theological implications of McQuaid's death before his identification. Had he escaped justice, or had divine justice operated on a timeline invisible to human understanding? The questions were unanswerable, but they reflected the community's deep need to make sense of events that had shaped their collective experience for nearly 3 decades. Patricia's case became a touchstone for discussions about crime, punishment, and the evolving nature of law enforcement in an era of rapidly advancing technology. The drive to Patricia's grave had become a ritual for her daughters, but this visit felt different from all the others that had preceded it over 27 years. They carried fresh flowers, and something else, the knowledge of who had killed their mother, the name that had eluded investigators for decades, the truth that had finally emerged from microscopic evidence preserved since 1995. Patricia's headstone was simple, reflecting the modest nature of a woman who had never sought attention during her life. The inscription bore her name, birth and death dates, and a brief phrase about loving mother and faithful friend. Her daughters had often wondered if they should add something about seeking justice, about never giving up, about truth eventually prevailing. Now they understood that the stone itself was enough. Patricia's story would live in their memories and in the case files that had finally been marked closed. They placed the flowers carefully, arranging them the way Patricia had always liked her garden, neat but not rigid, colorful but not ostentatious. The October afternoon was crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn light that Patricia had always loved. Her daughters stood quietly, each lost in their own thoughts about the long journey from that terrible August day in 1995 to this moment of bittersweet resolution. The conversation with their mother was quiet and one-sided, filled with the updates they had wanted to share for so many years. "We know his name now, Mom. Donald Dean McQuaid. We know who did this to you. We know it wasn't anyone you knew, wasn't anyone you trusted. He's gone now, died years ago, but we know who he was." A candle was lit at Patricia's headstone, its flame flickering in the afternoon breeze but holding steady against the wind. The light would burn for hours, a small beacon marking not just grief but resolution, not just loss but the triumph of truth over time, science over secrecy, love over violence. The unused subpoena sat in Detective Rodriguez's desk drawer, a legal document that would never be served because its intended recipient had been dead for 20 years. The paperwork represented everything that traditional justice required but could not achieve. In Patricia's case, the formal process of compelling a suspect to answer for his crimes in a courtroom before a jury of his peers. Rodriguez had worked enough cold cases to understand the frustration that families felt when scientific breakthroughs identified killers who were beyond the reach of prosecution. Genetic genealogy had revolutionized cold case investigation, but it couldn't resurrect the dead for trial. Justice in these cases had to take different forms: public acknowledgement of guilt, family closure, historical record correction, and the deterrent effect of knowing that time alone would not protect criminals from identification. Patricia's daughters struggled with the absence of traditional legal proceedings more than they had expected. Knowing McQuaid's name answered the question that had haunted them for decades, but it raised new questions about fairness, punishment, and the meaning of accountability when the accused could never defend himself or face consequences for his actions. Support groups for families of homicide victims included other members who had experienced similar situations, cases solved years or decades after perpetrators had died, leaving families with answers but not satisfaction, knowledge but not justice, closure but not the cathartic experience of watching guilty verdicts delivered in crowded courtrooms. The legal system was designed around the presumption that suspects were alive to face charges, that evidence would be presented in court, that guilty parties would receive sentences proportional to their crimes. Patricia's case challenged those assumptions, forcing everyone involved to reconsider what justice meant when traditional legal processes were impossible. The subpoena would remain unserved, a symbol of justice denied by time but also of truth that transcended the limitations of earthly courts. Patricia's killer had been identified with scientific certainty, and that identification would stand as his permanent legacy regardless of whether he had ever faced trial. The support group met monthly in a church basement, bringing together families whose lives had been shattered by unsolved violence. The chairs arranged in a circle represented years of shared grief, mutual understanding, and the unique bond that formed between people who had experienced similar losses under different circumstances. Patricia's daughters attended their first meeting 6 months after McQuaid's identification, still processing emotions that shifted daily between gratitude for answers and frustration with the absence of traditional justice. They found themselves among parents whose children's cases remained unsolved, spouses whose partners' killers had never been identified, siblings whose brothers and sisters had died without anyone being held accountable. The group discussions revealed the complex psychology of families living with violent loss. Some members had been waiting for decades without any progress in their cases, clinging to hope that diminished but never completely disappeared. Others had experienced the bittersweet resolution that Patricia's daughters now understood: cases solved years after perpetrators had died, providing answers without the satisfaction of punishment. A facilitator who had lost her own daughter 20 years earlier led conversations that explored themes of forgiveness, acceptance, and the different forms that justice could take when traditional legal processes failed. She had learned to find peace in knowing her daughter's killer had been identified, even though he had died before arrest. Her wisdom helped newer group members understand that healing didn't require courtroom victories, that closure could come in forms they had never imagined. Patricia's daughters discovered that speaking their mother's story aloud to people who truly understood made the experience more bearable. The group provided a safe space to express frustration, sadness, and even relief without judgment from people who had never experienced the unique trauma of losing a loved one to unsolved violence. The circle of chairs became a sanctuary where Patricia's memory lived alongside other victims whose stories deserved to be remembered, honored, and shared. The laboratory equipment that had unlocked Patricia's case represented a revolution in forensic science that most people could barely comprehend. DNA analysis tools that had seemed like science fiction in 1995 had become routine by 2022, capable of extracting genetic profiles from evidence that earlier generations of investigators would have considered useless. Task force members often reflected on the transformation they had witnessed in cold case work. Cases that had seemed hopeless for decades were being solved at an unprecedented rate, bringing closure to families who had long since given up hope for answers. Patricia's case was one of dozens that Washington State had resolved using genetic genealogy, with hundreds more in various stages of analysis. The success created new challenges and opportunities. Families of other unsolved homicide victims began reaching out to law enforcement, hoping their cases might also benefit from advanced DNA analysis. The backlog of potential cases far exceeded the resources available for genetic genealogy research, forcing investigators to prioritize based on evidence quality, case age, and likelihood of successful resolution. Training programs were developed to teach investigators how to use genetic genealogy tools effectively while respecting privacy concerns and ethical considerations. The techniques that had identified McQuaid as Patricia's killer required access to genetic information that millions of Americans had voluntarily provided to ancestry websites, raising questions about consent, privacy, and the appropriate uses of consumer genetic data. Patricia's case became a template for best practices in cold case genetic genealogy, careful evidence preservation, methodical family tree construction, rigorous scientific verification, and respectful communication with victim families throughout the process. The lessons learned from her investigation would be applied to hundreds of other cases, extending her legacy far beyond her own story. The laboratory where her killer's DNA had finally been decoded continued its work, processing evidence from other unsolved cases, unlocking secrets that had been hidden for decades. The vigil candles flickered in the evening breeze, hundreds of small flames representing lives lost to violence and families still seeking answers. The annual event brought together survivors from across Washington State, united by their common experience of loss and their shared hope for justice, even when justice seemed impossible. Patricia's name was read aloud, along with dozens of others, each representing a story of interrupted life and enduring grief. Her daughters stood among other family members, listening as the names of the murdered were spoken into the gathering darkness, ensuring that victims would not be forgotten even when their cases remained unsolved. The ceremony had been organized by families who understood that healing required community, that isolation deepened grief, and that sharing stories of loss could somehow lighten the burden that each family carried alone. Some attendees represented cases that had been solved, others were still waiting for answers, but all were united by their refusal to let their loved ones disappear into statistical anonymity. Sky lanterns were distributed as the formal program concluded, each family receiving paper lanterns that would carry their wishes and memories into the night sky. Patricia's daughters wrote their mother's name on their lantern, "Thanks for watching," along with a message of gratitude to the investigators who had never given up on her case and the scientists who had developed tools to unlock decades-old secrets. As the lanterns were released simultaneously, the evening sky filled with points of light ascending toward the stars. The visual metaphor was powerful but unspoken, love and memory rising above earthly limitations, carrying the stories of the murdered toward whatever justice existed beyond human understanding. The crowd watched in silence as the lights grew smaller and finally disappeared, leaving behind the quiet satisfaction of having honored their loved ones in a way that acknowledged both loss and transcendence, both grief and hope. The speaking podium felt familiar now to Patricia's daughters, who had become advocates for cold case funding and genetic genealogy research in the years following their mother's case resolution. They traveled throughout Washington State and beyond, sharing Patricia's story as an example of what was possible when families refused to give up hope and investigators committed resources to scientific advancement. Their testimony before legislative committees was powerful not because of rhetorical skill, but because of authentic experience. They could speak with authority about the decades-long pain of not knowing who had killed their mother, about the impact of false leads and dead ends on families desperate for answers, about the transformative power of finally learning the truth, even when traditional justice was impossible. The advocacy work gave new meaning to Patricia's death, transforming her from a victim of unsolved crime into a catalyst for policy changes that would help other families avoid the decades of uncertainty that her daughters had endured. Her case became a symbol of both investigative persistence and scientific possibility, proof that advancing technology could unlock mysteries that had seemed permanently sealed. Funding for genetic genealogy programs increased partly because of stories like Patricia's, compelling evidence that cold case investigation was not futile but simply required different tools and longer timelines than contemporary homicide work. Her daughters could see their mother's legacy extending far beyond her own case, touching families they would never meet but who would benefit from the techniques developed through cases like hers. The applause that followed their presentations was not just appreciation for their testimony, but recognition of their courage in transforming private grief into public advocacy, personal loss into policy change, individual tragedy into collective hope. Patricia's story had become larger than her death, her legacy more enduring than her life, her impact extending into a future she would never see but had somehow helped to shape. The rural road near Olalla was quiet on the autumn afternoon when Patricia's daughters made their final pilgrimage to the place where their mother had died. 28 years had passed since that August night in 1995, and the location looked much the same: evergreen trees reaching toward gray skies, pavement stretching through forests that seemed to absorb sound and hold secrets. They parked where the crime scene tape had once fluttered in the morning breeze, where investigators had collected evidence that would wait decades to reveal its secrets, where their mother's body had lain until a passerby discovered what no one should have to see. The spot held no marker, no memorial plaque, nothing to indicate that a life had ended there and a family's long journey toward truth had begun. The prayer they whispered was simple: words of gratitude for answers finally received, forgiveness for those who had failed to provide them sooner, and peace for the man whose death had made traditional justice impossible. They had learned that healing required releasing anger, that closure came not from punishment but from understanding, that their mother's memory lived not in the place where she died, but in the love she had taught them and the strength she had given them to endure. The rural road near Olalla held many stories: logging trucks and school buses, family trips and daily commutes, ordinary journeys of ordinary people living ordinary lives. Patricia's story was part of that history now, her tragedy woven into the collective memory of a place that had been touched by violence but not defined by it. As they drove away, Patricia's daughters carried with them the knowledge that truth had finally emerged from decades of silence, that their mother's killer had been identified even though he would never face earthly judgment, that healing was possible even when justice took forms they had never imagined. The road remained quiet, witness to both tragedy and resolution, both loss and the strange victory of love that endures beyond death, beyond time, beyond the limitations of human justice.